August 1945. London celebrates victory over Japan Day while Winston Churchill signs documents in a darkened room at 10 Downing Street. The war is won. The empire saved. But Churchill knows what the cheering crowds don't. Britain is financially destroyed. The treasury is empty. The pound is worthless. American negotiators are already en route with terms that will strip away everything Britain fought to preserve. The nation has £3 billion in external debt, worth £150 billion today with no way to pay. Victory parades fill the streets, but bankruptcy papers fill the Prime Minister's desk. What happened next would transform the world's greatest empire into America's dependent client state, and the real cost of winning World War II would only become clear in the decades that followed. In 1939, Britain stood at the apex of global power. The empire controlled 1/4 of the world's land surface and population. London was the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was the international reserve currency, used in 60% of global trade. Britain held £864 million in gold and foreign currency reserves, approximately £43 billion in today's money. British investments overseas totaled £3.5 billion, generating passive income that had sustained the empire for generations. But beneath this facade of strength lay a troubling reality. Britain's industrial supremacy had eroded. By 1939, the United States produced more steel, more cars, more oil, and more manufactured goods than Britain by factors of 3, 4, even 10 to 1. Germany's rearmament had created an industrial war machine that Britain couldn't match without external financing. The Royal Navy remained supreme, but maintaining it consumed 20% of government revenue. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Britain's political leadership faced an agonizing calculation. They could honor their guarantee to Poland and declare war, knowing it would drain the treasury. Or they could stand aside and watch Hitler dominate Europe unchallenged. Neville Chamberlain, who had tried desperately to avoid war, understood the financial implications better than anyone. His treasury advisors warned that Britain could sustain a major war for perhaps 3 years before facing bankruptcy. They declared war anyway. The official story taught in schools presents Britain's World War II effort as a heroic national struggle, with brave pilots winning the Battle of Britain and steadfast civilians enduring the Blitz. American Lend-Lease aid arrived just in time. The partnership won the war, and Britain emerged victorious alongside its allies. The economic dimension rarely features in popular history. It's treated as dry accounting, irrelevant to the grand narrative of good defeating evil. But the economic story is the real story. Britain didn't just fight World War II. It liquidated 3 centuries of accumulated imperial wealth to survive it. The war wasn't won through industrial production or military genius alone. It was won by converting every asset, every overseas investment, every gold bar, every diplomatic IOU into ammunition, ships, and food. And when those ran out, Britain signed away its future to American creditors who demanded precise terms for every dollar of aid. The financial bloodletting began immediately in September 1939 and never stopped until long after Victory Day. What follows is the story of how winning the war destroyed the British Empire, not through military defeat, but through bankruptcy. September 1939. The hemorrhaging begins immediately. Britain starts the war with a fatal disadvantage. It must import almost everything to fight. Oil, steel, machine tools, aircraft components, food. All must be purchased overseas and shipped across submarine-infested waters. The United States, with its Neutrality Acts still in force, demands cash payment for everything. No credit, no delayed payment, gold, dollars, or nothing. The British Treasury implements a policy they call cash and carry. Think of it like being forced to pay cash up front at a store where you once had unlimited credit. Every British merchant ship departing New York Harbor represents not just military supplies, but gold bars physically loaded onto vessels and sent westward across the Atlantic. By the end of 1939, Britain has spent £150 million of its gold reserves, pounds 7.5 billion in today's money, in just 4 months. Chancellor of the Exchequer John Simon delivers the grim news to Cabinet in December 1939. At current rates of expenditure, we will exhaust our gold and foreign currency reserves by mid-1941. After that, we cannot pay for American supplies. The timeline is brutally simple. 18 months until Britain can no longer buy the weapons needed to continue fighting. But gold reserves are just the beginning. The Treasury identifies £1 billion in British overseas investments, shares in American railroads, Argentine utilities, South African mines, Malaysian rubber plantations. These represent centuries of accumulated British wealth, generating dividends that had helped fund the Royal Navy and subsidize the empire. Chancellor Simon proposes selling them. All of them. The cabinet debates this for exactly one meeting. They have no choice. In early 1940, the Treasury creates the British Purchasing Commission in the United States with extraordinary powers. Sell any British-owned asset in the Americas to raise dollars for war supplies. American investment banks gleefully arrange fire sales. British shareholders in American companies, many who had held these investments for generations, receive government orders to surrender their shares for immediate sale. The proceeds go directly to the Treasury to buy bombers and bullets. One particularly brutal example, Courtaulds, a British textile company, owned American Viscose Corporation, worth approximately £60 million. The British government forced the sale in 1941, accepting just £37 million, a 40% discount, because they needed dollars immediately. American investors snapped it up. British shareholders lost £23 million, £1.15 billion today, in wealth destruction that funded perhaps 3 months of war expenditure. Then France falls in June 1940, and the financial situation becomes catastrophic. Britain now stands alone against Nazi Germany. The weekly expenditure on the war effort reaches £60 million, £3 billion per week in modern terms. Gold reserves drain at terrifying speed. By September 1940, during the height of the Battle of Britain, when Churchill delivers his stirring speeches about fighting on beaches, the Treasury calculates Britain has perhaps 4 months of purchasing power remaining. 4 months until Britain cannot buy oil from American refineries. 4 months until Britain cannot purchase aircraft components from American factories. 4 months until Britain cannot feed its population without American grain shipments. Churchill writes desperate letters to Franklin D. Roosevelt. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. He warns in December 1940. The Prime Minister, who publicly projects defiant confidence, privately begs the American president for help, because the alternative is surrender or starvation. Roosevelt faces his own constraints. The American public opposes entering another European war. Neutrality Act provisions forbid loans to belligerent nations. But Roosevelt also understands that if Britain falls, Germany will dominate Europe, threatening American interests worldwide. The solution Roosevelt proposes in December 1940 will save Britain from immediate collapse, but at a price that will become clear only later. By the end of 1940, Britain has spent or pledged for sale nearly all its gold reserves and liquidated £1 billion in overseas assets. The empire that had accumulated wealth for centuries has burned through 200 years of investment returns in 18 months. And the war is just beginning. They've bought time, but they've sold the future. What happened next would lock Britain into a dependency relationship with the United States that continues to this day. March 1941. Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act, and Britain's financial sovereignty ends. Roosevelt presents Lend-Lease to the American public with a folksy metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't demand payment before lending them your garden hose. The propaganda presents American aid as generous, altruistic support for embattled democracy. The reality is far more calculated. American negotiators arrive in London with specific demands that will restructure global commerce in America's favor once the war ends. The core principle of Lend-Lease: America will provide military supplies, food, and materials on loan, without immediate cash payment. Britain doesn't need to pay until after the war, and payment might be in kind rather than currency. On paper, this sounds like salvation. Britain can keep fighting without draining its last gold bars. But examine the contract terms, buried in diplomatic correspondence between Washington and London, and the true structure emerges. First, the Article 7 provision. Hidden in the Lend-Lease agreement is language requiring Britain to commit to eliminating discriminatory trade practices after the war. In diplomatic language, this seems innocuous. In practice, it means dismantling imperial preference, the system of tariff advantages that Britain had negotiated with its empire and dominions to favor British goods over American competitors. Since 1932, Britain had used imperial preference to maintain its commercial empire. Canadian wheat entered Britain at lower tariffs than American wheat. Indian textiles received preferential treatment over Japanese competitors. Australian wool got advantages over Argentine wool. This system kept commerce flowing through British financial institutions in London, maintained demand for pound sterling, and preserved British economic influence even as its industrial supremacy faded. American negotiators view imperial preference as the single biggest obstacle to American commercial expansion. Secretary of State Cordell Hull tells Roosevelt explicitly, "We must use Britain's financial dependency to break open the empire's closed trading system." Lend-Lease becomes the lever. Churchill understands immediately what Article 7 means. In a heated war cabinet meeting in 1942, he erupts, "We are being asked to dismantle the empire as payment for American help in saving it." He's not wrong. But what choice does Britain have? Without Lend-Lease supplies, Britain cannot feed its population or fuel its military. Churchill signs. Second, the audit regime. American officials embedded in British government departments monitor how Lend-Lease supplies are used. They ensure that nothing provided under Lend-Lease generates commercial advantage for British exporters. In practice, this means British manufacturers cannot use Lend-Lease steel to build products for export, only for direct war purposes or domestic consumption. Think of it this way. America provides the raw materials to keep Britain alive, but prohibits Britain from using those materials to compete commercially with American exports. British industrial capacity must be directed entirely toward survival and war, not toward maintaining Britain's export markets. While Britain fights, American manufacturers capture British export markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Markets Britain had dominated for a century slowly reorient toward American suppliers who don't have factories being bombed and populations being rationed. Third, the gold provision. Even under Lend-Lease, Britain must continue paying cash for any supplies that could be produced within the empire. If Britain can produce something domestically or source it from Canada, Australia, or India, then it cannot receive that item under Lend-Lease. It must pay in gold or dollars. This creates perverse incentives. Britain is encouraged to reduce its own industrial production to qualify for more Lend-Lease aid. British factories that could produce certain goods are mothballed because it's cheaper to receive them as Lend-Lease than to manufacture them domestically and preserve gold reserves. Industrial capacity built over centuries atrophies because maintaining it disqualifies Britain from American aid. By 1944, Leo Amery, Secretary of State for India, writes in his diary, "We have reduced ourselves to a pensioner dependent on American willingness to keep us supplied. We cannot negotiate. We can only accept terms." The numbers tell the dependency story. From 1941 to 1945, Britain receives $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease aid, approximately $550 billion in today's dollars. This dwarfs Britain's remaining economic capacity. In 1944 alone, Lend-Lease supplies represent 25% of British GDP. Without it, Britain faces immediate famine and military collapse. But Britain also sends $6.8 billion in reverse Lend-Lease to the United States, providing bases, facilities, and support for American forces in Britain. Britain provides this despite being the economically weaker party, because American negotiators insist on it to make Lend-Lease politically palatable to Congress. The psychological impact runs deeper than the financial. British officials who once set the terms of global trade now sit in American offices, pleading for extensions of aid shipments. Treasury representatives who once dictated terms to borrowers worldwide now explain to American accountants why Britain needs more flour, more oil, more steel. The empire that had financed railways across 5 continents now depends on American bureaucrats approving requisition forms. Churchill maintains public defiance. "We shall never surrender." But in private correspondence with Roosevelt, the tone is supplicant. If you cannot provide tankers for fuel oil by October, Churchill cables in 1943, our military operations will cease. This is not how great powers negotiate with equals. When Germany surrenders in May 1945, Britain has survived. The island was not invaded. Democracy persevered. The Nazi regime was defeated. But Britain's economic independence was sacrificed to achieve it. And then, with victory in Europe barely celebrated, American negotiators deliver the final blow. Lend-Lease is ending. Immediately, August 21st, 1945, Japan surrenders. 6 days later, President Truman signs executive order terminating Lend-Lease. The abruptness shocks British officials. Ships already at sea carrying Lend-Lease supplies turn around mid-ocean and return to American ports. Deliveries scheduled for September simply don't arrive. Britain's wartime supply pipeline shuts off like a faucet being turned. The new Labour government, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee after Churchill's surprise election defeat in July, faces immediate crisis. Britain needs to import £2 billion annually in food, raw materials, and goods to maintain basic living standards. Without Lend-Lease, Britain must pay cash for everything. But Britain has no cash. The gold reserves are gone. The overseas assets have been sold. The Treasury has £3 billion in external debt and perhaps £500 million in remaining reserves, enough for 3 months of imports. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most famous economist, leads the negotiating team to Washington. Keynes believes British and American interests align. Both nations defeated fascism, both support democracy. Surely America will offer generous terms to help Britain recover. He encounters American negotiators who see opportunity, not charity. The negotiations begin in September 1945 and continue through December. They are brutal. American negotiators, led by Treasury officials Fred Vinson and William Clayton, present Britain with a choice: accept our terms for a loan, or face financial collapse within months. There is no third option. Britain cannot borrow from anyone else. Every other potential creditor was also devastated by the war. The United States holds all leverage. Keynes proposes what he calls a justice loan. $6 billion at 0% interest, with repayment delayed for decades, as compensation for Britain's earlier wartime sacrifices while America remained neutral. He argues that Britain fought Hitler for 2 years alone, suffered enormous casualties, and deserves financial support without onerous conditions. The American team rejects this instantly. Clayton responds, "The American taxpayer has already provided $31 billion in Lend-Lease. We seek commercial terms, not further subsidies." The American demands, first, the loan amount, $3.75 billion at 2% interest, plus a separate $1.19 billion Canadian loan. Total, $4.94 billion, worth approximately $85 billion in today's currency. This is far below the $6 billion Keynes requested, and far below what British officials calculate they need. Second, repayment terms, 50 annual installments beginning in 1951. Unlike Keynes's proposal for indefinite postponement, repayment begins just 6 years after the war ends, when Britain will still be recovering. The 2% interest rate, while below commercial rates, still accumulates. Over 50 years, Britain will repay $7.5 billion, nearly double the principal. Third, and most consequentially, the conditions attached to the loan. Sterling convertibility. Britain must make the pound sterling freely convertible to dollars within 1 year. This means anyone holding pounds can demand dollars at the official exchange rate. It prevents Britain from using currency controls to manage its trade deficit and preserve reserves. Dissolution of the sterling area. The sterling area, a system where British Empire and Commonwealth nations traded in pounds and held sterling reserves in London, must be dismantled. This had been a key mechanism for British financial influence. Countries from India to Malaysia to Egypt would no longer be required to hold pounds or trade through London banks. End of imperial preference. The Article 7 provision from Lend-Lease becomes formal treaty obligation. Britain must eliminate tariff advantages for empire goods and open its market to American exports on equal terms. Settlement of Lend-Lease debt. Britain must pay $650 million for Lend-Lease supplies still in Britain when the war ended, including partially used supplies that Britain had assumed were gifts. Keynes calls these terms harsher than we have ever received from any other creditor. In letters to friends, he writes that the negotiations felt like fighting a Gestapo interrogation. The British cabinet debates acceptance for weeks. Chancellor of the Exchequer Hugh Dalton warns that rejecting the loan means immediate austerity far worse than anything experienced during the war. We will have to cut food rations by 30%, halt industrial recovery, and face mass unemployment. Britain survived Hitler but might not survive economic collapse. The cabinet debates alternatives. Could Britain simply repudiate its debts and start fresh? No, that would destroy all future borrowing capacity. Could Britain borrow from the Soviet Union? Stalin has no dollars and seeks aid himself. Could Britain impose extreme austerity and withdraw from global commitments? That would mean abandoning military occupations in Germany and Japan, granting immediate independence to colonies, and retreating to island isolation that in December 1945. The cabinet votes 15-3 to accept the American loan terms. But domestic opposition in both countries nearly kills the deal. In the United States, conservatives oppose bailing out British socialism. The new Labour government has nationalized industries and created the National Health Service. In Britain, both left and right oppose the terms. The left sees it as American imperialism. The right sees it as humiliating surrender of Britain's empire. The House of Commons debates the loan agreement in December 1945. Robert Boothby, Conservative MP, delivers this devastating summary. We are now reduced to the position of a suppliant at the door of the United States Treasury. We have fought 2 world wars for what? To substitute American for British hegemony. Labour MP Richard Stokes puts it more bluntly. This is economic enslavement to the United States. Despite fierce opposition, Parliament approves the loan in December 1945. The U.S. Congress follows suit in July 1946, after extensive debate about whether Britain deserved help. The money begins flowing in July 1946. It evaporates almost immediately. Remember the convertibility clause? In July 1947, exactly 1 year after receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound freely convertible as required. Within 6 weeks, panic ensues. Anyone holding pounds rushes to convert them to dollars, fearing the pound will collapse. Britain's currency reserves hemorrhage $1 billion in just 42 days, nearly a quarter of the entire loan. Chancellor Dalton suspends convertibility in August 1947, violating the loan terms. American officials protest, but cannot enforce it. Britain simply has no reserves left to continue. The loan that was supposed to fund British recovery for years has been depleted in months, consumed by currency speculation and trade deficits. By early 1948, Britain faces another financial crisis and must seek additional American aid through the Marshall Plan. Yet another program with strings attached. The final insult. Britain made its final loan repayment in December 2006. 60 years after receiving the money, Britain sent a final check for £45 million to the U.S. Treasury, closing out the World War II debt. 3 generations of British taxpayers paid for their grandparents' victory over Hitler. The total amount repaid, with accumulated interest, $7.5 billion, worth approximately $140 billion in 2006 currency values. To put this in perspective, Germany, which lost the war and caused massive destruction, never repaid war debts on this scale. The Marshall Plan aid to rebuild Western Europe, including to former Axis powers, was almost entirely grants, not loans. Britain, which fought from 1939 to 1945, was still repaying war debts while Germany's post-war economic miracle was in full bloom. The American loan didn't fund British recovery. It funded British survival just long enough to dismantle the empire in an orderly fashion. The financial demolition doesn't end with the loan. It accelerates. Britain emerges from the loan negotiations in 1946 with neither adequate funding nor economic sovereignty. The next 25 years become an exercise in managed decline, selling off imperial assets, withdrawing from global commitments, and repeatedly begging for American financial support during sterling crises. First casualty. India.in February 1947, Prime Minister Attlee announces Britain will grant India independence by June 1948. The official narrative presents this as enlightened decolonization, Britain gracefully granting self-determination to its largest colony. The financial reality. Britain cannot afford to keep India. Garrisoning British troops in India costs £120 million annually, approximately £5 billion in modern currency. Britain's military budget is already stretched supporting occupation zones in Germany and Japan, maintaining Mediterranean garrisons, and funding commitments across the empire. The Treasury calculates that holding India would require raising taxes or slashing domestic spending on food rations and housing reconstruction. Moreover, India owes Britain nothing. During World War II, Britain had forced India to provide supplies for the war effort, paying with sterling IOUs. By 1945, India held £1.3 billion in sterling balances, money Britain owed to India. Indian leaders, led by Nehru, were demanding repayment in gold or goods. Britain had neither. Granting independence allowed Britain to negotiate writing down much of this debt. Independence comes in August 1947, 6 months ahead of schedule. The rush timeline contributes to partition violence that kills perhaps 1 million people. But from the British Treasury's perspective, independence resolved an impossible financial burden. Second casualty, Palestine. In 1947, Britain announces withdrawal from the Palestine Mandate by May 1948, dumping the intractable Jewish-Arab conflict in the United Nations lap. Again, the financial calculation is clear. Maintaining 100,000 troops in Palestine costs £40 million annually, £1.6 billion today. Britain cannot afford to stay. Third casualty, the sterling area. From 1947 to 1950, Britain attempts to maintain the sterling area, the system where empire nations held pounds and traded through London, as required by the American Loan Agreement. But the system bleeds reserves. Every time a sterling area country, India, Australia, South Africa, Egypt, runs a trade deficit with the United States, it converts its sterling reserves to dollars, draining British reserves. The sterling area that once channeled global commerce through British banks becomes a mechanism for hemorrhaging Britain's remaining dollars. By 1949, Britain devalues the pound from $4.03 to $2.80, a 30% collapse, trying to make British exports competitive and stem the bleeding. Then comes the Korean War in 1950, triggering another crisis. Commodity prices spike. Britain must pay higher prices for imported food, rubber, and oil. The Treasury exhausts its reserves again by late 1950. Chancellor Gaitskell travels to Washington seeking emergency dollar aid. American negotiators provide $300 million, but demand that Britain increase defense spending to support American Cold War efforts. Britain must cut domestic spending to afford larger military budgets, pleasing Washington while impoverishing British citizens. The Suez Crisis of 1956 delivers the final humiliation. When Egyptian President Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, Britain and France launch a military operation to retake it, acting without American approval. President Eisenhower is furious, not about the military action per se, but about being ignored by supposedly subordinate allies. Eisenhower's Treasury Secretary, George Humphrey, executes financial retaliation. America dumps British pounds on currency markets and refuses to support Britain at the International Monetary Fund. Sterling collapses. Britain faces immediate financial crisis. Eisenhower delivers an ultimatum to Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Withdraw from Egypt immediately, or America will allow sterling to collapse completely. Eden has no choice. British and French forces withdraw in humiliation. The Suez Crisis crystallized the new global order. Britain could not conduct independent foreign policy without American approval. Financial dependency meant geopolitical subordination. Eden resigns shortly after, reportedly telling colleagues, "We learned that Britain is now a satellite of the United States." The 1960s bring more decline. Britain maintains military commitments east of Suez, bases in Singapore, Malaysia, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa, trying to preserve some global influence. But every sterling crisis forces cuts. In 1967, Britain devalues the pound again, from $2.80 to $2.40. Prime Minister Harold Wilson goes on television telling Britons that the pound in your pocket has not been devalued, which becomes a byword for political dishonesty as import prices immediately rise. By 1968, Britain announces total military withdrawal from east of Suez. The bases close. The garrisons come home. Britain retains only minimal overseas presence. The final collapse comes in 1971. 4 decades. Britain had maintained an illusion that the pound sterling remained a global reserve currency alongside the dollar. Foreign governments and banks still held significant sterling balances. But repeated devaluations and crises had undermined confidence. In August 1971, President Nixon ends dollar-gold convertibility, terminating the Bretton Woods system. Sterling loses its last anchor to global commerce. The pound floats freely, its value determined by market forces rather than managed exchange rates. By the mid-1970s, sterling represented less than 5% of global currency reserves, down from 60% in 1939. The British pound, which once financed global trade and underwrote empire, became merely the currency of a medium-sized European economy. The human cost manifests in austerity that lasted decades. From 1945 to 1954, 9 years after the war ended, Britain maintained strict rationing. Meat, butter, sugar, and clothing were rationed longer in peacetime than during the war. The ration on sweets and candies wasn't lifted until 1953. British civilians endured deprivation for nearly a decade after victory because Britain had no money for imports. Housing reconstruction lagged for decades. Bomb damage from the Blitz remained visible in London into the 1960s. The National Health Service, created in 1948, immediately faced funding crises as the Treasury prioritized debt repayment and military spending over domestic services. Emigration surged. Millions of Britons left for Australia, Canada, and other Commonwealth nations in the 1950s and 1960s, seeking opportunity unavailable in economically stagnant Britain. The brain drain accelerated British decline. The most ambitious and skilled citizens departed. What started as a 48-hour financial crisis in 1940 became a 30-year liquidation. Britain sold £1 billion in overseas investments from 1939 to 1945. Britain borrowed $4.94 billion from America in 1946 and repaid $7.5 billion over 60 years. Britain devalued the pound 3 times between 1945 to 1971. Britain granted independence to most of its empire between 1947 to 1968, not primarily from enlightened idealism but because it couldn't afford to stay. The empire that ruled 1/4 of the world in 1939 controlled less than 1% of the world's population by 1971. The currency that dominated 60% of global trade in 1939 represented less than 5% by 1971. The nation that once dictated terms to the world spent 3 decades accepting terms dictated by American creditors and international markets. And the tragic irony: Britain might have ended up in a similar position even without winning World War II. If Britain had negotiated a separate peace with Germany in 1940, as some cabinet members urged, it might have preserved its empire and finances. But it would have lived in a Nazi-dominated Europe. If Britain had remained neutral like Spain, it would have preserved its wealth but abandoned Europe to totalitarianism. Britain chose to fight, knowing the cost. The tragedy is that British citizens weren't told the true price. They were told they fought for freedom, democracy, and empire preservation. They weren't told they were mortgaging their children's prosperity to American creditors who would demand decades of repayment and force the empire's dissolution anyway. In September 1939, Britain entered World War II as a global superpower. In August 1945, Britain celebrated victory as a bankrupt debtor nation. The war cost £34 billion, approximately £1.4 trillion today, representing 3 years of Britain's entire GDP. That money didn't disappear. It transferred to American banks, American factories, and American asset holders who bought British overseas investments at fire sale prices. The real story of World War II isn't about military battles alone. It's about the largest wealth transfer in modern history, executed under the pressure of existential crisis. Britain liquidated 3 centuries of accumulated empire wealth in 6 years, converting every pound of imperial investment into bombs, bullets, and ships to survive Nazi conquest. American negotiators understood Britain's desperation and extracted maximum advantage, dismantling imperial preference, ending sterling's dominance, opening the empire to American commerce and transforming Britain into a dependent client state. This wasn't malicious, it was the rational pursuit of American interests. But it was decisive. Today, we still see echoes of this transformation. The special relationship between Britain and the United States is fundamentally asymmetric. Britain needs American support far more than America needs Britain. Brexit debates revealed Britain's continued struggle to define its global role 80 years after the war that bankrupted the empire. The pound's steady decline as a reserve currency continues, today representing less than 4% of global reserves. When we say Britain won World War II, we should be precise about what victory meant. Britain survived, democracy prevailed, fascism was defeated. But Britain lost its empire, its financial independence, and its global preeminence. The British people paid the price of victory through decades of austerity, rationing, and diminished prospects, while former enemies like Germany and Japan rebuilt with American grants and became economic powerhouses. The untold stories of empire continue. Follow the money, and the real history emerges, not of heroes and villains, but of desperate choices made under impossible pressure, and the long-term consequences that echo through generations. This video is an educational documentary created with AI assistance. Historical facts and figures are drawn from academic sources, declassified government documents, and economic histories of the period. While we strive for accuracy, interpretation of historical events can vary among historians. We encourage viewers to explore primary sources and diverse historical perspectives.